The fluorescent lights flickered one final time before plunging the abandoned subway platform into absolute darkness. Kestrel pressed her back against the cold tile wall, listening to the shallow breathing of 6 other souls who had found refuge in this forgotten corner of the underground transit system. Above them, the city that had once pulsed with 3 million heartbeats now echoed only with the shuffling footsteps and guttural moans of the infected. "The emergency batteries should kick in soon," whispered Thaddeus, his weathered hands fumbling with a small flashlight. The 70-year-old former subway engineer had become their unofficial guide through the labyrinthine tunnels that snaked beneath the metropolis. His intimate knowledge of every maintenance shaft, abandoned platform, and forgotten passage had kept them alive for the past 3 weeks. Zoria shifted nervously beside the rusted bench where young Selim sat hunched over his salvaged laptop, its screen providing the only source of light in their makeshift sanctuary. The 17-year-old had managed to tap into emergency communication networks, becoming their lifeline to the outside world. What he discovered there rarely brought comfort. "Any word from the evacuation centers?" Kestrel asked, though she already knew the answer from Selim's expression. His dark eyes reflected the blue glow of the screen as he shook his head slowly. "The last transmission from Riverside Station went dark 6 hours ago," he said quietly. "That makes 4 senders in the past week." Indira pulled her sleeping daughter closer, the 8-year-old Emery's unconsciously clutching a threadbare stuffed elephant. The pediatric nurse had lost her husband on the first day of the outbreak when their apartment building became overrun. She'd managed to escape through a fire exit with only Emery's and the clothes on their backs. Stellan emerged from the shadows where he'd been standing guard at the platform's edge. The former security officer's military bearing remained intact despite the dirt and exhaustion that marked his face. "We need to talk about supplies," he said grimly. "We're down to less than 2 days of water, and the food situation isn't much better." The weight of their predicament settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. They had discovered this particular platform by accident during their 2nd week underground, when a section of tunnel had collapsed behind them, cutting off their retreat. What had initially seemed like a trap had become their salvation. The debris effectively sealed them off from the infected hordes above, but it also meant there was only one way out. Kestrel had emerged as their leader not through any conscious decision, but through the quiet strength she displayed when others faltered. Before the outbreak, she had worked as a crisis counselor for the city's emergency services. Those skills, honed through years of helping people navigate their darkest moments, had proven invaluable in their current circumstances. "Tell me about the maintenance tunnels again," she said to Thaddeus. "The ones that lead toward the industrial district." The old engineer's brow furrowed as he considered the routes in his mind. "There's a service corridor that runs parallel to the main line for about 2 miles. It connects to the old freight terminals, but—" He hesitated, his voice trailing off. "But what?" Zoria pressed. The 24-year-old art student had surprised everyone with her resourcefulness, fashioning tools and weapons from discarded materials with an ingenuity born of desperation. "But it passes directly under Memorial Hospital," Thaddeus finished. "If the reports we heard were true, that's where it all started." Ground Zero. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness beyond their platform. Each of them understood the implications. Memorial Hospital had been the first facility to report cases of the infection. Within hours, it had become a death trap as the virus spread through patients and staff with terrifying efficiency. Selim's laptop chimed softly, and he quickly muted the sound. "I'm picking up a new signal," he whispered urgently. It's a distress beacon. Military frequency. Coming from somewhere close to the surface." As if summoned by his words, a low rumbling sound began to reverberate through the tunnel system. It wasn't the familiar rhythm of a subway train, those had stopped running weeks ago. This was something else entirely, something that made the platform vibrate beneath their feet and sent small fragments of concrete raining down from the ceiling above. "That's not good," Stellan muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the makeshift weapon at his side. The rumbling grew louder, and with it came another sound that made their blood run cold, the distant but unmistakable chorus of infected voices, drawn by whatever was causing the disturbance above. Their sanctuary, which had protected them for so long, suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. The rumbling intensified, and through the network of ventilation shafts and service ducts, they could hear the chaos erupting on the streets above. Zoria pressed her ear to the wall, her face pale in the laptop's glow. "That's heavy machinery," she whispered. "Construction equipment, maybe military vehicles." Selim's fingers flew across his keyboard as he attempted to triangulate the source of the military distress signal. "It's moving," he reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Whatever's broadcasting that beacon, it's heading northwest, toward the river district." Thaddeus consulted the hand-drawn map he'd been creating of their underground world, marking safe passages and blocked routes with methodical precision. "If they're trying to reach the river, they'll have to pass over us," he said grimly. "This tunnel runs directly beneath Riverside Avenue." The sound of concrete cracking somewhere above their heads sent a shower of dust cascading onto the platform. Emery stirred in her mother's arms, her eyes fluttering open with the confused expression of a child waking into a nightmare she couldn't quite understand. "Are the monsters coming?" she asked in a small voice that carried clearly in the stillness. Indira smoothed her daughter's hair, forcing calm into her voice. "No, sweetheart. We're safe down here. Just some noise from the streets." But they all knew how fragile that safety had become. The infected might not be able to reach them directly through the collapsed tunnel entrance, but if the activity above grew intense enough, it could compromise the structural integrity of their hiding place. They had seen what happened when buildings collapsed during the early days of the outbreak. The infected were drawn to the noise like sharks to blood. Stellan had moved to the far end of the platform, where an emergency ladder led up to a sealed maintenance hatch. He climbed halfway up and pressed his ear to the metal cover, listening intently. When he climbed back down, his expression was troubled. "There's definitely fighting up there," he reported quietly. "Gunfire, explosions. But there's something else." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "The infected, they're organized. Moving in patterns instead of just wandering randomly." Kestrel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground dampness. During their weeks in hiding, they had observed the infected through various access points and security cameras that Selim had managed to tap into. The creatures had shown basic pack behavior, but what Stellan was describing suggested something far more disturbing. "Evolution," Selim said suddenly, looking up from his screen. "I've been monitoring radio chatter from the remaining military outposts. They're reporting similar patterns in other cities. The infected are adapting, learning." Zoria sank onto the bench beside him, her usual composure cracking. "How long before they figure out how to get down here?" Before anyone could answer, the military beacon signal that Selim had been tracking suddenly cut out. The laptop screen flickered as he attempted to re-establish contact, but there was nothing except static on all frequencies. "They're gone," he said simply. The implications hung heavy in the air. Another group of survivors, possibly their last hope of rescue, had been silenced. They were more alone than ever in their underground tomb. Thaddeus cleared his throat, drawing their attention to his map. "There might be another option," he said slowly. Before the outbreak, the city was working on expanding the subway system. They'd excavated several new tunnels but hadn't completed the connections. One of them leads to an emergency bunker beneath the government district. "How far?" Kestrel asked. 3 miles through unmapped territory. Some of those tunnels might be flooded, others could be blocked by construction equipment. And there's no guarantee the bunker is even operational. Stellan studied the rough sketches on Thaddeus's map. "What about the route through Memorial Hospital's basement? You mentioned it connects to the freight terminals." "Shorter distance, but Thaddeus shook his head. If that's ground zero, the concentration of infected could be overwhelming. A new sound reached them from above, the metallic shriek of twisting steel followed by a thunderous crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Emergency lighting finally activated along the platform, bathing them in a sickly red glow that made their faces look like specters. The building above us, Zoria breathed, staring at the ceiling where hairline cracks were beginning to spider outward from the impact point. Indira gathered Emery's closer, her medical training warring with maternal instinct. We need to move. Now. But as if responding to some unheard signal, the moaning sounds from above began to change, becoming more purposeful, more directed. The infected weren't just wandering anymore, they were searching. Selim's laptop chimed once more, and he quickly switched to a local emergency frequency they had been monitoring. Through the static, a familiar voice emerged, clear, desperate, and far too close for comfort. This is Dr. Marcus Webb, Memorial Hospital basement level. If anyone can hear this transmission, please respond. We have a small group of survivors, including medical personnel and... The transmission cut to static, then resumed. The infection appears to be mutating. The subjects are showing increased cognitive function and coordinated behavior. If there are any military units in the area, we need immediate extraction. The voice fell silent, replaced by the steady hiss of dead air. But in that silence, they could hear something else, footsteps echoing through the tunnel system, still distant but growing closer. They found us, Stellan said quietly, his hand moving to the improvised weapons they had crafted from subway maintenance tools. Dr. Webb's transmission replayed in Kestrel's mind as she studied the faces of her companions. The medical team at Memorial Hospital represented hope, trained professionals who might understand the infection better than anyone still alive. But reaching them would mean abandoning their sanctuary and venturing through territories that could be crawling with the infected. We vote, she said finally. Stay here and hope our hiding place holds, or make a run for the hospital basement. Emery's had fallen back asleep against her mother's shoulder, blissfully unaware of the deliberation that would determine her fate. Indira looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, then back at the group. As a mother, every instinct tells me to stay hidden. But as a nurse... She took a shaky breath. If there are medical personnel working on this thing, Emery's deserves a chance at a real future, not just survival. Thaddeus traced his finger along the route to Memorial Hospital on his map. The maintenance corridors that direction haven't been used in years. Some of the older sections date back to the 1940s. They were built to withstand bombing during the war, so they should be structurally sound. But there are areas where they intersect with the hospital's sub-basement levels. Zoria had been unusually quiet, her artistic mind processing information in ways that often surprised the group. The infection spreads through bites, right? But also through airborne particles in confined spaces. If we're going underground toward ground zero, we need to consider atmospheric contamination. Selim looked up from his laptop, where he had been analyzing the radio frequencies for any additional transmissions. I've been thinking about Dr. Webb's message. He mentioned increased cognitive function in the infected. What if that's not just random evolution? What if they're being directed somehow? Stellan finished checking their meager arsenal of improvised weapons, crowbars, broken pipes, anything that could serve as a makeshift club or blade. In military terms, you're describing a command structure. But these things don't exactly seem like they're taking orders. Maybe not orders, Selim continued, his teenage mind making connections that eluded the adults. But what if some of them retain enough human memory to remember building layouts, security systems, ways to get into places they couldn't access before? The footsteps they had heard earlier seemed to have stopped, but the silence was almost worse than the sound had been. It suggested the infected above were no longer randomly searching, they were waiting, planning. Kestrel made her decision. We go tonight. Thaddeus, you know these tunnels better than anyone. Can you get us to Memorial Hospital's basement levels without exposing us to the main corridors? The old engineer nodded slowly. There's a service tunnel that was part of the original pneumatic postal system from the 1800s. Most people don't even know it exists anymore. It'll be tight, maybe flooded in sections, but it should connect to the hospital's foundation level. They spent the next hour preparing for their journey. Indira created makeshift first aid kits from the medical supplies she had salvaged. Zoria fashioned torch handles from broken metal pipes and soaked strips of fabric and maintenance oil they had found in a storage closet. Stellan distributed their few real weapons, a security guard's baton he had carried since the beginning, and a knife that Zoria had crafted from a broken subway tile. As they prepared to leave, Selim made one final attempt to establish communication with Dr. Webb's team. The radio crackled to life just as he was about to give up. "Is Webb again? Situation deteriorating rapidly. The subjects are exhibiting pack hunting behavior and appear to be communicating through subsonic vocalizations. We've barricaded ourselves in the old morgue facilities, but..." Static overwhelmed the transmission for several seconds. Oxygen getting thin. "If anyone receives this message, we're located in basement level 3, sector 7. Following the old pneumatic postal tunnel should lead directly to our position." Kestrel exchanged glances with Thaddeus. How could he know about the postal tunnel? "Hospital records," the engineer replied grimly. During construction of the newer wings, they would have had to map all existing infrastructure to avoid damaging it. As they gathered their supplies and prepared to venture into the unknown darkness beyond their platform sanctuary, Emrys woke again. This time her eyes were fully alert, taking in the adults' preparations with the unsettling perceptiveness that children sometimes displayed in crisis situations. "We're going to find other people, aren't we?" she asked her mother. Indira hesitated, then decided on honesty. "We're going to try, sweetheart. There are some doctors who might be able to help everyone get better." "The monsters too?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. None of them had considered whether the infected could be cured, or if they were beyond help. It had been easier to think of them as irredeemably lost, but now a child's innocent question forced them to confront a possibility that was both hopeful and terrifying. "Maybe," Indira whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. They formed a line behind Thaddeus as he led them away from their platform refuge for what they all suspected might be the last time. The emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to reach for them as they walked deeper into the tunnel system. Behind them, their temporary home disappeared into darkness, taking with it any chance of retreat. The old pneumatic postal tunnel entrance was hidden behind a rusted maintenance panel that Thaddeus had to force open with a crowbar. The passage beyond was barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, and the air that emerged carried the musty scent of decades-old decay mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. "Single file," Thaddeus whispered. "And whatever happens, don't stop moving." The pneumatic postal tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare of cast iron pipes and accumulated debris from a century of abandonment. Thaddeus led the way with one of Zoria's improvised torches, its flickering light revealing walls encrusted with calcified deposits and strange, pale growths that seemed to pulse in the shadows. The air grew thicker with each yard they crawled, carrying an increasingly metallic taste that made their throats burn. Behind Thaddeus, Kestrel fought against waves of panic as the tunnel walls seemed to press closer with every movement forward. She had never been comfortable in confined spaces, but the knowledge that they were crawling through the bowels of an infected city made each breath a struggle. Behind her, she could hear Indira whispering soothing words to Emrys, who had remained remarkably calm despite the terrifying circumstances. "There's an intersection ahead," Thaddeus called back softly. "According to my calculations, we should go left toward the hospital's foundation level." As they reached the junction, Selim's voice emerged from the rear of their human chain. "Wait. Do you hear that?" They all froze, straining to listen above their own labored breathing. Through the metal walls of the tunnel, they could detect a rhythmic sound, not the random shuffling of the infected they had grown accustomed to, but something deliberate and coordinated. "Marching," Stellan whispered grimly. "They're moving in formation." The sound grew louder, and with it came the realization that the infected above were following a specific route, one that seemed to parallel their own path toward Memorial Hospital. Whatever was drawing the creatures to that location, it was the same destination they were struggling to reach. Zoria's artistic eye had been noting details others missed during their crawl through the tunnel. "Look at these growths on the walls," she whispered, pointing to the pale, fleshy masses they had been avoiding. "They're not random. There's a pattern to them, like they're following the air circulation system." Indira's medical training kicked in as she examined one of the growths more closely. "These look almost like neural tissue," she said with growing alarm. "As if the infection has somehow taken root in the infrastructure itself." The implications were staggering. If the virus had evolved to the point where it could colonize the physical environment, then nowhere would be truly safe. The very tunnels they were using for shelter could be serving as an extension of the infected organism's sensory network. Selim had been monitoring his laptop throughout their crawl, watching for any changes in the radio signals from Dr. Webb's team. "The transmission strength is getting weaker," he reported. "Either their equipment is failing, or they're running out of time," Kestrel finished for him. They pressed forward through the left branch of the tunnel, but their progress slowed as they encountered sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed, forcing them to squeeze through gaps barely large enough for their bodies. Emery's, being the smallest, moved through these obstacles most easily, but the adults struggled, their clothing catching on jagged metal edges and their shoulders scraping against unforgiving concrete. As they approached what Thaddeus estimated was the halfway point to their destination, the tunnel suddenly opened into a larger chamber, part of the hospital's original foundation system. The space was filled with a network of pipes and electrical conduits, but what immediately drew their attention were the sounds echoing from the levels above. Medical equipment, Indira identified, recognizing the distinctive beeping of monitors and ventilators. "There are people up there, and they're keeping someone alive." But interwoven with the mechanical sounds were others less encouraging, the scraping of clawed fingers against metal, the low moaning that had become the soundtrack of their nightmarish new world, and occasionally, something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. Thaddeus consulted his map again, trying to orient himself in the larger chamber. "We need to find the access shaft that leads to basement level 3. It should be somewhere along the eastern wall." As they searched, Stellan noticed something that made his military instincts scream warnings. "Those pipe growths we've been seeing, they're all oriented in the same direction." Pointing upward, toward the hospital. "Like a nervous system," Zoria added, her artist's eye seeing patterns that others missed. "As if something is using the infrastructure to sense what's happening throughout the building." They found the access shaft hidden behind a tangle of steam pipes that hadn't been used since the hospital's renovation decades earlier. The ladder rungs were rusty and some were missing entirely, but it appeared to be their only route to Dr. Webb's location. "I'll go first," Stellan volunteered, testing the first few rungs. "If this thing gives way, at least you'll know not to follow." But as he began to climb, Selim's laptop chimed with an incoming transmission. Dr. Webb's voice emerged from the speakers, but it sounded different now, strained, panicked, barely human. "This is Dr. Webb, basement level 3. We're out of time. The subjects have breached our barricades. I'm transmitting everything we've learned about the infection's progression. The virus isn't just reanimating dead tissue, it's creating a collective consciousness. The infected are becoming nodes in a larger network, and something is directing them from." The transmission cut to static, then nothing. In the silence that followed, they could hear new sounds from above, the systematic destruction of barriers, the splintering of wood and metal, and underneath it all, a sound that chilled them to their bones. Singing. Human voices raised in perfect harmony, but singing words in no language any of them recognized. "We have to get up there," Indira said urgently. "If there are still survivors." But even as she spoke, they could hear the systematic search beginning above them. Footsteps moved with purpose through the hospital's basement levels, no longer the random wandering of mindless creatures but the methodical pattern of hunters who knew exactly what they were looking for. The infected had found Dr. Webb's team. And now they were looking for the source of the transmission that had drawn other survivors to their location. Against all logic and survival instinct, they climbed. Stellan ascended first, testing each rung and reporting back on the stability of the ancient ladder. The shaft seemed to stretch endlessly upward, disappearing into a darkness that felt more oppressive than any they had encountered in their weeks underground. As they climbed, the sounds from the hospital above became clearer and more disturbing. The systematic searching they had heard earlier had given way to something worse, a coordinated effort to break through whatever barriers Dr. Webb's team had erected. But interspersed with the sounds of destruction were human voices, screaming not in pain but in ecstasy, as if the process of being infected was bringing them some form of transcendent joy. Kestrel found herself thinking about Selim's theory of the infected developing a command structure. What if the virus hadn't just preserved some human memories and cognitive functions, but had actually enhanced them in specific ways? The singing they had heard suggested a level of coordination that went beyond simple pack behavior. When they reached the top of the shaft, Stellan carefully opened the access panel and peered into the basement corridor beyond. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lighting, and the air carried the antiseptic smell of a hospital overlaid with something organic and putrid. He motioned for the others to remain quiet as he slipped through the opening. The basement level of Memorial Hospital was a maze of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and administrative offices that had been abandoned when the main floors became overrun. But as they made their way towards Sector 7, following the directional signs mounted on the walls, they began to encounter evidence of Dr. Webb's team's desperate struggle for survival. Barricades constructed from hospital furniture and equipment blocked several corridors, but all had been systematically dismantled from the outside. What was most disturbing was the precision with which the obstacles had been removed, not torn apart in a frenzy of hunger, but carefully disassembled as if the infected possessed engineering knowledge. "Over here," Zoria whispered, pointing to a series of symbols painted on the wall in what appeared to be blood. The markings were unlike anything any of them had seen, not random scratches or territorial markers, but complex geometric patterns that suggested a form of written communication. Indira shuddered as she recognized certain elements of the symbols. Some of these looked like medical diagrams, anatomical references, as if they're documenting what they've learned about human physiology. They continued deeper into the basement, guided by the hospital's signage toward the morgue facilities where Dr. Webb had made his final transmission. The sound of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the corridor, despite their efforts to move silently. When they reached Sector 7, they found the morgue's entrance sealed by a heavy steel door that had been welded shut from the inside. But someone, or something, had been working methodically to cut through the metal. Precise torch marks showed where the infected had been attempting to break through, demonstrating a level of tool use that defied everything they thought they knew about the virus. Selim set up his laptop and attempted to establish contact with anyone who might still be alive inside the morgue. "Dr. Webb, this is the group that received your transmission. We're at the entrance to Sector 7. Please respond." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, they heard a voice from beyond the steel door, not Dr. Webb, but a woman speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "You shouldn't have come here. The virus has evolved beyond anything we initially observed. It's not just reanimating the dead anymore, it's creating a distributed intelligence that can access and retain memories from every person it infects." Stellan examined the torch marks on the door more closely. "They'll break through this barrier within hours. We need to get you out of there." "No," the woman's voice replied firmly. Dr. Webb discovered something before he. She paused, and they could hear her moving around in the space beyond the door. "The infection isn't random. It's selective. It preserves and enhances certain types of knowledge while destroying others. Medical knowledge, engineering, technical skills, these are being retained and shared across the infected population." Kestrel felt a chill of understanding. That's why they're so organized. They have access to the accumulated knowledge of every doctor, engineer, and technician they've infected. Exactly. But there's more. The virus appears to be preparing for something. We found evidence in the infected tissue samples that suggests it's trying to establish permanent colonies, not just spread randomly. The implications were staggering. If the infected were developing the ability to form stable communities with retained human knowledge, they would quickly become the dominant species on Earth. "Who are you?" Indira asked the voice beyond the door. "Dr. Sarah Kellner, infectious disease specialist. I was part of Dr. Webb's research team. We've been studying tissue samples from the infected for the past week, and what we've discovered." Her voice trailed off as they heard the distinctive sound of metal being cut somewhere in the distance. "They're coming," Emery said quietly, her child's hearing picking up sounds the adults had missed. Through the morgue's ventilation system, they could hear the infected moving through the upper levels of the basement, no longer searching randomly but converging on their location with purposeful intent. The cutting sounds grew closer, and they realized that the infected had been working on multiple entry points simultaneously. "Dr. Kelmer," Kestrel called urgently, "we're going to try to cut through this door from our side. You need to tell us everything you've learned about the virus." "There isn't time," came the reply. "But listen carefully, the infection is building towards something. A critical mass of infected individuals that will allow the collective consciousness to achieve a higher level of organization. We estimate that point is only days away." As if summoned by her words, the sounds of cutting stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, they could hear something far more terrifying, the infected moving through the corridors around them, but moving silently now, coordinating their approach to surround the morgue completely. "They're not just hunting us," Stellan realized with growing horror. "They want us to hear what Dr. Kelmer is saying. They want to know what she's discovered." The voice beyond the door came once more, urgent and desperate. "The samples we studied showed cellular modifications that suggest the virus is preparing the infected for some kind of mass-coordinated event. But we couldn't determine what form it would take." From the darkness of the corridor behind them came a sound that froze their blood, slow, rhythmic clapping, as if something was applauding Dr. Kelmer's revelation. The applause continued, joined by additional sets of hands clapping in perfect synchronization. From the shadows of the corridor emerged figures that had once been human, hospital staff still wearing their scrubs and lab coats, but moving with an unnatural grace that spoke of the intelligence now controlling their actions. What made the sight most horrifying was the expression on their faces. These weren't the mindless, aggressive creatures they had observed from a distance. These infected individuals displayed awareness, even what appeared to be pleasure at the unfolding situation. "Fascinating," said one of them in a voice that was distinctly human, though carrying an odd harmonic quality as if multiple speakers were coordinating to produce the words. "Dr. Kelmer's research has been most illuminating. We appreciate the contributions of her team to our understanding." Stellan moved protectively in front of the group, but he realized the futility of the gesture. They were completely surrounded, and their improvised weapons would be useless against the coordinated intelligence they now faced. The infected doctor who had spoken approached with measured steps. "Dr. James Morrison, Chief of Infectious Diseases," he introduced himself with terrible civility. "I was part of the team that first identified the pathogen. My memories of that research have been invaluable to our development." Behind the steel door, Dr. Kelmer's voice carried a note of despair. "James? My God, you're still aware. You're still yourself." "I am myself, and so much more," Dr. Morrison replied. "The virus doesn't destroy consciousness, Sarah. It elevates it. We retain our individual memories and personalities while gaining access to a collective knowledge base that grows with each new addition to our community." Kestrel forced herself to speak despite the terror clawing at her throat. "What do you want from us?" Dr. Morrison's infected eyes regarded her with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "To help you understand. The old world is ending, but we're offering something far superior. A society without conflict, without the isolation and pain that defines human existence. Every infected individual contributes their knowledge and experience to a shared consciousness that benefits all." "In our humanity?" Indira asked, clutching Emery's closer. "Enhanced, not destroyed. We feel more deeply than we ever did as isolated individuals. We experience joy, wonder, even love, but magnified through our collective connection." From beyond the morgue door, Dr. Kelmer's voice carried new urgency. "Don't listen to them. We analyzed the neural tissue from infected subjects. The personality changes aren't voluntary. The virus modifies brain chemistry to create artificial feelings of euphoria and belonging. They're not experiencing enhanced emotion, they're experiencing chemical manipulation." Dr. Morrison's expression didn't change, but several other infected individuals moved closer, their coordinated movement suggesting communication through means beyond speech. Dr. Kellner's interpretation is limited by her isolated perspective, Dr. Morrison replied. She cannot comprehend the beauty of what we've become because she clings to an obsolete concept of individual consciousness. Selim, who had been quietly observing the exchange, suddenly spoke up. You're still experimenting, aren't you? That's why you haven't just infected us immediately. You're studying our reactions, learning how we think. Perceptive, Dr. Morrison acknowledged. The integration process is most successful when subjects understand and accept the transformation willingly. Forced conversions, while possible, result in less optimal outcomes. Zoria found her voice despite the terror. What happened to Dr. Webb? Dr. Webb made a choice, came a new voice from the shadows. A figure stepped forward that they recognized from Selim's intercepted transmissions, Dr. Marcus Webb himself, but transformed. His movements were fluid and purposeful, his eyes bright with an unsettling intensity. Marcus, Dr. Kellner whispered from behind the door. You said you would rather die than become one of them. Death is what I feared, Dr. Webb replied, his voice carrying that same harmonic quality they had noticed in Dr. Morrison. But this isn't death. This is transcendence. Sarah, you've isolated yourself in that morgue, surrounded by the dead, when you could be joining something alive and beautiful beyond imagination. The infected had formed a circle around Kestrel's group, but they made no aggressive moves. Instead, they seemed content to wait, to let the psychological pressure of the situation work on their prey. We know about your group's journey through the tunnels, Dr. Morrison continued. We know about your sanctuary on the subway platform, about your fears and hopes and the bonds you've formed with each other. That kind of connection, that loyalty and love, imagine experiencing it not just with 6 other people, but with thousands. Millions. Emrys, who had been silent throughout the encounter, suddenly looked up at her mother. Mommy, why are they so sad? Indira looked at her daughter in confusion. What do you mean, sweetheart? Behind their eyes. They're pretending to be happy, but they're really, really sad. The infected individuals exchanged glances, and for just a moment, Dr. Morrison's artificial composure seemed to crack. In that instant, Kestrel saw something that Dr. Kellner's research hadn't captured. The infected weren't just chemically manipulated. Part of their original consciousness was still trapped inside, aware of what they had become but unable to resist the virus's control. Children sometimes see what adults cannot, Dr. Webb said quietly, and there was a note in his voice that suggested the man he had been was still fighting to be heard. From the morgue came Dr. Kellner's voice, now tinged with desperate hope. Marcus, if any part of you is still fighting this thing, you need to help these people escape. The virus may have enhanced your cognitive abilities, but it's also made you slaves. You know this isn't really you. The silence that followed was broken by a sound from the upper levels of the hospital, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the entire building. The infected turned their heads in unison toward the source of the sound, their expressions shifting from artificial serenity to something approaching alarm. What is that? Stellan demanded. Dr. Morrison's reply carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Something unexpected. The collective consciousness is reporting an external threat that wasn't part of our projections. Through the hospital's ventilation system came the distant sound of engines, heavy machinery, and something else, human voices shouting orders with military precision. The pounding from above grew more intense, accompanied by the distinctive whine of industrial cutting equipment. The infected around them began to move with increasing agitation, their perfect coordination fracturing as they received conflicting instructions from their collective consciousness. Military extraction team, Stellan identified grimly. They're cutting through the hospital's upper floors. Dr. Morrison's facade of control cracked completely as he pressed his hands to his temples, his face contorting in pain. Too many voices, he gasped. The network is being disrupted. External electromagnetic interference. Through the chaos, Dr. Kellner's voice emerged from the morgue with desperate urgency. The military must be using some kind of signal jamming technology. We theorized that the infected's collective communication might be vulnerable to specific electromagnetic frequencies, but we never had a chance to test it. As the jamming intensified, the infected began to behave erratically. Some clutched their heads in obvious pain, while others moved in stuttering, uncoordinated patterns as their connection to the collective consciousness wavered. Most remarkably, several individuals seemed to be fighting against invisible restraints, as if their original personalities were struggling to reassert control. Dr. Webb collapsed to his knees, his voice returning to something approaching normal human inflection. "Sarah," he called toward the morgue door. "The jamming is giving us moments of clarity. Windows where we can resist the virus's control. But it won't last long." Kestrel realized this might be their only chance. "Thaddeus, is there another way out of this level?" The old engineer consulted his mental map of the hospital's layout. "Emergency exit stairs at the end of this corridor. They should connect to the hospital's parking structure." "We need to get Dr. Kellner out of the morgue first," Indira insisted. But Dr. Kellner's response came through the door with heartbreaking finality. "No. The morgue's sealed containment system is the only thing keeping the virus samples we collected from contaminating the environment. If I open this door, everything we've learned about the infection will be lost." Explosions echoed from the floors above as the military team continued their systematic advance through the hospital. The infected around them were becoming increasingly violent as their collective control deteriorated, but their aggression seemed unfocused, more like the random violence of the early outbreak than the coordinated intelligence they had displayed minutes before. Dr. Webb, still fighting to maintain his fleeting humanity, grabbed Kestrel's arm with desperate intensity. "Listen to me while I can still think clearly. The virus is preparing for a mass transformation event. When the infected population reaches critical mass, they'll release airborne spores that can convert the remaining human population within days. You have to warn whoever comes after us." "How long do we have?" Selim asked, still clutching his laptop despite the chaos around them. "Weeks, maybe less. The collective consciousness has been gathering infected individuals from across the region. When they achieve the critical mass of roughly 50,000 infected, the biological transformation will accelerate beyond anything we've seen." The jamming signal suddenly intensified, and Dr. Webb convulsed as his connection to the virus was completely severed. For a moment, his eyes cleared entirely, and he looked at his hands with horror and recognition. "My God, what have I become?" But the clarity was brief. As the jamming signal fluctuated, the virus reasserted its control, and Dr. Webb's expression returned to the artificial serenity they had witnessed earlier. The window of human consciousness had closed. "Go," Dr. Kellner's voice urged from beyond the morgue door. "Take what we've learned and find others who can use this information. The electromagnetic jamming proves the collective consciousness has weaknesses. There might still be hope." They ran through corridors filled with confused and violent infected, following Thaddeus toward the emergency stairs. Behind them, they could hear Dr. Kellner beginning to transmit her research data on all frequencies, desperately trying to share her team's discoveries with whoever might be listening. As they reached the stairwell, the sound of her transmission was cut short by the scream of metal being torn apart. The infected had broken through the morgue's barriers, but by then, her final act of sacrifice had already been completed. The emergency stairs led them upward through a nightmare landscape of partially destroyed hospital floors and the aftermath of military operations. Bodies of both infected and soldiers lay scattered in the corridors, testament to the fierce battle that had raged through the building. When they finally emerged into the daylight of the parking structure, they found themselves in the middle of a military evacuation zone. Soldiers in hazmat suits immediately surrounded them, weapons raised, until medical personnel could confirm they weren't infected. As they were loaded into a military transport vehicle, Kestrel looked back at Memorial Hospital. Smoke rose from several floors, and she could see figures moving behind the windows, infected individuals trying to restore their collective network, unaware that their secrets had already been shared with the surviving human resistance. Emrys tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Are we safe now?" Indira looked at her daughter, then at the desolate cityscape rolling past their vehicle's windows. The infected were no longer mindless creatures shambling through the streets. They were an evolving intelligence with access to human knowledge and technology, preparing for a final transformation that would reshape the world. "No, sweetheart," Indira replied honestly. "But we know things now that we didn't know before. And sometimes, knowing is the first step toward fighting back." As their transport carried them toward an uncertain future, the radio crackled with transmissions from resistance cells across the region. Dr. Kellner's final broadcast had reached them, and the information about electromagnetic jamming was already being shared among the scattered survivors. The infected had evolved beyond their initial expectations, but so had humanity's understanding of their enemy. The war for the future of human consciousness had only just begun, and both sides now possessed weapons they hadn't had before. In the distance, the city's skyline was broken by columns of smoke rising from a dozen different locations. The battle for Memorial Hospital had been just one engagement in a much larger conflict, and neither side could claim victory. But for the first time since the outbreak began, the surviving humans had hope, and that hope was built on the sacrifice of those who had chosen knowledge over safety, truth over survival. The underground survivors had emerged into a world transformed, carrying with them the most precious cargo of all, the understanding that their enemy, for all its terrible evolution, was not invincible. Can